Okay, let's do this quickly, but I'm not going to promise that it's going to be simple, but it will be direct. Don't we know for sure that George Washington freed his slaves? Yes, he did. Even if it was on his death, no, it wasn't on his death. It was in his will, but it was on Martha's death, on the death of his wife. So if Martha would have lived another 20 years, then his slaves were going to be enslaved for another 20 years. It's Martha, for whatever reason, and we can guess what those might have been, decided to free Washington's slaves earlier than her death, assuming that tying her death to their freedom, not the world's best idea for 123 enslaved people around her, freed them early. So about a year after Washington's death, George Washington dies in December 1799, Martha frees his slaves in January of 1801. And then she just goes ahead and dies a year later. But in the end, it's Martha who frees Washington's slaves early. Washington tied their freedom to her lifetime. So that's what we got. He did free one person outright in his will, Billy Lee, who had been his personal servant during the war. So he frees them. He also creates some mechanisms to provide for the support of enslaved people, again, on Martha's death, that would enable them to be educated, enable the people who were too old to be supported, again, on Martha's death. It's Martha that moves all of that up considerably, depending upon how long you might have thought Martha was going to live. There's another codicil in his will that deals with slaves that he owned by virtue of some debts that Bartholomew Dandridge owed him, and for them he created a complicated manumission structure that wouldn't take effect, like he tied it to Martha, that wouldn't take effect until the death of Dandridge's widow. So he wanted to make sure, and this is what is clear and obvious about all this. He wanted to make sure that no one in his immediate world would have to live with the inconveniency of being without enslaved people. He wasn't going to live without the inconveniency of living without them, and he didn't want Martha to live with the inconveniency of being without them. Now, most of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon and all of the farms around them were actually not owned by George Washington. Washington owned, like I said, I think the count was 123 men and women and children. The most of the enslaved people, I think 150 or more, were owned by Martha and by the Custis estate, the estate of her first husband, and therefore they flowed to her grandchildren. But that's what we got. Even though Washington is unique, and a lot is made of that, of being the only founder who freed his slaves, again, he didn't know how long Martha was going to live. And it's Martha who freed them early. But she doesn't free her own slaves because she can't, because she doesn't actually own them, right? They flow through to her grandchildren. But she does free George Washington's slaves early. Again, probably not the world's best idea to tie the freedom of 123 people to her individual life. And she probably saw that, understood that. Historians have interpreted it in that way. Washington's ownership of slaves has been looked at by a number of historians. It should be looked at by more people. It's certainly a good public history subject, but that not dealt well by Mount Vernon's, certainly. But Henry Wincheck wrote a book called An Imperfect God about it. He argued that Washington went through some sort of epiphany about how slavery was wrong. That's bunk. Phil Morgan, my colleague here at Hopkins, wrote a really good response in an article about Washington and slavery. That set forth what it is that I think made the argument that I think is probably closest to the truth, that Washington's economic interests outweighed his moral qualms about slavery at every turn. And given even what we have studied more about slavery and what I have looked at more about Washington and slavery, that seems to be absolutely the case. And that is the case in which Washington is absolutely consistent with every single one of the other patriots, that their self-interest is going to take a backseat to nobody. Their self-interest, their economic interest, is not going to be a secondary consideration to the interest of anybody else in their freedom. And so certainly not during their lifetime. They are not going to have to deal with the problem. They are not going to take the hit. So we can talk about Washington and slavery, and we can talk about the fact that he does more after Martha's death to make his people, to set his people free. But it is complicated, and it is, even though he makes statements about it in his will to make sure that it's kind of ironclad, tying it to Martha's death is pretty problematic. And the fact that he's not going to do anything about it during his lifetime. If we limit it to that, to the who is in fact doing anything about slavery in their lifetime, he does nothing about it. He is no different from anybody else. All he does is push off the problem to somebody else, and in that, he is the same as everybody else.